The plan went exactly as the Americans had hoped. The Japanese forces at Trek were completely taken by surprise. They hadn't expected an attack, especially not one so sudden and overwhelming. 2 weeks earlier, Admiral Minichi Koga, the leader of the Japanese combined fleet, had moved the bulk of his fleet to Palau. This decision came after spotting American reconnaissance planes flying nearby. Koga assumed that Truk might be targeted, so he wanted to avoid losing his main fleet. However, he left behind several important units. These included 2 small cruisers, 8 destroyers, and many support vessels. There were also numerous transport ships loaded with valuable supplies, tanks, military vehicles, aircraft, artillery guns, and large numbers of troops. The Truk was also being used as a storage and refueling base, and on the island itself, more than 200 replacement aircraft were parked close together on the runways. These planes were waiting for pilots to fly them, which made them vulnerable targets. The defense of the base was supposed to come from 2 air units of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Force, the 22nd and 26th Kokusai, but the timing of the attack worked in America's favor. After being on full alert for 2 straight weeks, the Japanese had finally let their pilots take some rest, assuming the threat had passed. Unfortunately for them, that break came just before the actual assault. On the morning of February 17th, there were no Japanese planes patrolling the skies. Their radar system eventually picked up the incoming American aircraft, but by then, it was far too late to respond properly. Japanese pilots rushed to their planes to try and take off, but the American Hellcats were already diving down toward them. Truk, once thought to be an impenetrable stronghold, was now completely exposed and vulnerable to attack. One of the first squadrons to strike was VF-10, the Grim Reapers, flying from the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. Leading the charge was Lieutenant Commander William Killer Kane, a highly skilled and aggressive pilot known for his combat success. He and his wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Vernon Yudkin, were among the first to engage the enemy. As they approached, they were intercepted by 6 Japanese Zero fighters. 4 of the Zeros tried to stop them, but it didn't go well for the Japanese. Kane and Yudkin each shot down 1 enemy plane, and Yudkin set another on fire, causing it to crash. The 2 American pilots then flew low over the Eden runway, where they saw 2 Japanese Tojo fighters attempting to take off. The Japanese planes barely made it off the ground before Kane and Yudkin destroyed them, keeping up their momentum and proving once again why Kane had earned his nickname. Despite the surprise, a number of Japanese fighters managed to get airborne. Soon, Kane, Yudkin, and the rest of the Grim Reapers were locked in intense dogfights with enemy Zeros and float plane fighters called Roofs, which were slow but still dangerous in large numbers. Lieutenant Junior Grade Joseph Frenchy Rule spotted a Zero and shot it down from behind. Then he chased a Roof that was trying to escape by climbing into the sky. Even though his own plane was close to stalling, Rule stayed on the enemy and fired a deadly shot that brought it down. His determination paid off. He didn't stop there. He went on to destroy 2 more Zeros, specifically the Model 32 version, with square-shaped wings. With 3 kills that morning, Rule had an impressive run during the battle. The air battle was fierce, and not without losses. The Grim Reapers lost 1 pilot, Ensign Linton Cox, along with his Hellcat fighter, but in return, the squadron managed to destroy 14 enemy aircraft in the sky, and another 5 on the ground at the Eden airfield. Their success was a heavy blow to the Japanese defenses. At the same time, the VF-5 squadron from USS Yorktown had a different mission. They were sent to attack the Dublin seaplane base. As they arrived, 8 of their 12 Hellcats flew in low and opened fire on the target, tearing through the area with gunfire. Their surprise attack destroyed 5 Japanese flying boats that were parked near the water. After that, the pilots climbed back into the sky to join the larger dogfight happening above. Together, they shot down 3 Zeros, 3 Roofs, and 1 Japanese reconnaissance plane that the Allies referred to as a Pete. Only 1 American Hellcat was lost to enemy ground fire, and even that fire turned out to be far less powerful than they had expected. Higher in the sky, more American squadrons joined the battle. VF-6 from USS Intrepid and VF-9 from USS Essex were operating at medium altitude. As VF-6 approached Truk at 14,000 feet, 10 of their Hellcats dropped down to attack Menin Island's airfield. That left just 2 pilots flying higher. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrochu and his wingman, Andon Lewis Little. Suddenly, a group of Japanese Zeros appeared above them. Without hesitation, Vrochu and Little turned to face them, using their Hellcats' faster speed and better maneuvering to their advantage. Vrochu later explained that while Japanese pilots were brave, they often dove toward the sea or clouds once they started losing the upper hand. At high speeds, the Hellcat could outturn and outrun the Zero, which made it easier for American pilots to follow and shoot them down. Vrochu took advantage of this, bringing down 2 Zeros and 1 Roof, and then shooting another Zero as it came out of the clouds. Meanwhile, VF-9 also targeted the airfields at Manan and Pam. Just as they were about to attack, they were suddenly hit by a surprise attack from Japanese fighters. The third group of VF-9 was scattered by the sudden enemy move. In the middle of the chaos, Lieutenant Charles Mother shot down one Japanese plane, while his fellow pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Bill Brandon, managed to take down another pilot in their division. Lieutenant Junior Grade Eugene Valencia found himself completely surrounded by at least 6 enemy Zeros. Thinking quickly, he dove steeply from 14,000 feet, flying just above the ocean waves as the Japanese fighters chased him. As 2 of the Zeros tried to pass him, Valencia took them out one by one. He then targeted their leader and shot him down as well. When he returned to USS Essex, he made a joke, saying that if his Hellcat could cook meals, he'd marry it. His skill and quick thinking helped him survive, and he would later go on to become the 3rd highest scoring Navy fighter, ace of World War II. With a total of 23 aerial victories, the American attack on Truk was a complete success. The combination of surprise, superior aircraft, and skilled pilots overwhelmed the Japanese defenders. The battle showed the growing power of the U.S. Navy and the effectiveness of carrier-based airstrikes. It also marked a turning point, as Japan lost many planes and supplies it couldn't easily replace. Truk, once seen as a safe and powerful base, was no longer untouchable. As the battle raged on, the second group of VF-9 found themselves confronting several different formations of Japanese Zero fighters. Lieutenant Jack Kitchener, who led the division, immediately engaged the enemy and shot down a floatplane fighter, known as a roof, in a direct head-on clash. Without hesitation, he then shifted his focus to a Zero that was maneuvering nearby and managed to hit it hard enough to send it spinning downward toward the ocean. Although it wasn't confirmed whether that plane was completely destroyed, the damage it took made survival unlikely, while the second and third groups of VF-9 remained locked in intense aerial battles with multiple Japanese squadrons. The first group was left unchallenged for a short time. Taking advantage of the open skies, they descended on the airfields at Manon and Pam, flying at low altitudes. The American pilots launched multiple strafing runs, pouring machine gun fire across the runways and parked planes. Explosions and fires broke out as bullets ripped through aircraft that were sitting exposed. At least 25 Japanese planes were destroyed on the ground during these runs. Some enemy aircraft tried to take off in the chaos, but several were shot down before they could gain altitude. By the end of the day, the VF-9 squadron had scored a total of 21 aerial victories, with only a single Hellcat fighter lost in return. It was a striking success and a sign that the Japanese were not able to match American firepower and tactics. While these intense engagements were taking place, VF-18, flying from the aircraft carrier USS Bunker Hill, had been given the job of providing top cover. Their role was to remain higher in the sky, watching over the attack formations and ready to respond to any sudden enemy threats from above. Since most of the fighting was happening closer to the surface and around the airfields, VF-18 saw relatively little action during this phase. Still, they were able to shoot down one confirmed enemy plane, and possibly a second. Their presence ensured that any Japanese attempt to climb above the American formations would be quickly intercepted. The importance of their position, even with limited combat, helped keep the lower altitude squadrons safe. The overall sweep by American fighters had been very effective. The Japanese aircraft could not keep up with the superior speed, firepower, and maneuverability of the F-6F Hellcats. The American planes held a clear technological advantage, and this was reflected in the outcome. Japanese fighter losses were severe, and American losses remained low, with most of the enemy's air resistance either destroyed or scattered. The skies were now open for American dive bombers and torpedo planes to begin their next phase of the attack, going after the Japanese ships and buildings anchored and stationed. Throughout Truk Lagoon, the battle plan called for 6 major bombing strikes throughout the day, each labeled from A through F. These attacks were carefully timed, with 2-hour gaps between them. Within each wave, bomber groups would launch in 15-minute intervals. This spacing allowed each group to focus on its specific targets without getting in the way of the next. Every bomber group included a protective escort of Hellcat fighters to guard them from any remaining enemy aircraft. These bombers, mostly TBF Avengers, SBD Dauntlesses, SB-2C Helldivers, and others, would deliver a combination of fragmentation bombs, firebombs, and torpedoes depending on the type of target they were assigned. One of the early strike missions was carried out by 7 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers from Air Group 10. They flew along the route cleared earlier by the Hellcats, heading straight for Eaton Airfield. Alongside their Hellcat escorts, the Avengers dropped fragmentation bombs and incendiary explosives across the runways and parking areas. They also fired at aircraft still left on the ground. Despite the damage already done by earlier fighter sweeps, some Japanese planes had survived the first attack. A few Zero fighters had managed to take off and were now trying to defend the base. After finishing his attack run, Lieutenant Junior Grade Walter Harmon noticed one of these Zeros flying below him. He dived and fired a short burst that ripped through the enemy plane, sending it crashing into the water below. Other escort pilots flying alongside Harmon added 5 more kills during this mission. Just 15 minutes later, another bombing run began, this one aimed at the Manan Sea base. Air Group 6 carried out a similar attack, unleashing a wave of bombs and gunfire on the base, destroying more aircraft and damaging facilities. Their escort fighters also managed to bring down 3 more Japanese planes that were attempting to interfere. As the battle continued, more bomber groups arrived in waves, each one targeting different objectives. Some focused on destroying remaining airfields, while others went after critical infrastructure and fuel storage. But a large portion of the bombers had their sights set on Japanese naval vessels anchored in the lagoon. These included merchant ships, supply ships, support vessels, and even warships. The American attacks on the ships were devastating. Bombers dropped heavy explosives that tore through the decks and hulls of the enemy vessels. One of the first ships to be destroyed was a Japanese merchant tanker named Maru. It was hit directly during a bombing run led by Lieutenant Commander James Ramage from Air Group 10. The tanker erupted in flames and quickly began to sink. Not long after, another target, a huge 19,200-ton converted whaling ship named Tonin Maru No. 3 was struck by 2 1,000-pound bombs from a group of SPD Dauntless dive bombers. The damage was so severe that the ship began to slip underwater, sinking stern first as smoke and debris rose into the air. At around 8:30 in the morning, a particularly tragic and powerful moment occurred. Lieutenant James E. Bridges, piloting a TBF Avenger, launched a torpedo that struck the Japanese ship Ikoku Maru. The explosion from the torpedo alone might not have destroyed the ship, but Ikoku Maru was carrying a massive and dangerous load. Inside its forward cargo area were hundreds of naval mines, bombs, and boxes of ammunition. When the torpedo hit, it triggered a chain reaction that set off all the explosives. The result was a massive detonation that ripped through the entire front half of the ship. The force of the blast tore the bow off completely, creating a fireball and cloud of smoke so large it could be seen for miles. Pieces of the ship were thrown into the air, and a crater was carved into the lagoon seabed. Everyone in the front half of the ship, about 730 troops and nearly all of the crew, were killed instantly. Out of the 946 people on board, only one person survived. Lieutenant Bridges and his flight crew, who were flying close when the blast occurred, were also killed in the explosion. It was one of the most destructive single hits of the entire battle. As soon as the first wave of bombers finished their runs, the second wave began about an hour and 15 minutes later, followed by even more throughout the day. By this point, the remaining Japanese ships realized they had to escape or be destroyed. A group of ships tried to flee through the northern pass out of Truk Lagoon. Among them were the light cruiser Katori, the auxiliary cruiser Akagi Maru, the destroyers Mikaze and Nawaki, and the minesweeper shown in Maru No. 15. But they had very little chance. American planes were still swarming the area, and they weren't going to let any enemy vessels escape without a fight. Avengers from Air Group 10 launched more torpedoes at the fleeing ships. Katori and Mikaze were both hit hard, with their hulls torn open by explosions. Akagi Maru was struck by multiple bombs that caused powerful internal explosions, forcing the crew to abandon the burning vessel. Many of the survivors tried to board the already damaged Katori for safety, but it was also sinking fast. Other American air groups quickly joined in, launching more bombs and torpedoes at the fleeing ships. The attacks came in waves, one after another, making escape nearly impossible for the Japanese vessels. It was a relentless assault that demonstrated the full reach and power of American naval aviation. The last and most devastating part of the attack didn't come from the skies. Instead, it began when Vice Admiral Spruance, aboard the battleship USS New Jersey, was informed that some Japanese ships were trying to escape from the area. Rather than waiting or relying only on air power, he made a quick and bold decision to act himself. Some of the officers around him thought it was a risky move, but Spruance was determined to confront the enemy fate. He immediately called off the ongoing airstrikes and took command of a surface group, naming it Task Group 59. This powerful group included the battleships USS New Jersey and USS Iowa, the heavy cruisers USS New Orleans and USS Minneapolis, and for destroyers, together, this fleet set out toward the fleeing enemy, making their way around the atoll and firing at enemy coastal defenses as they advanced. When the American ships finally caught up with the escaping Japanese vessels, the battleship Iowa fired its huge guns first and struck the cruiser Katori, finishing it off. Meanwhile, the Japanese destroyer Mikaze attempted to retaliate by launching several torpedoes at the USS New Jersey. Fortunately, an American reconnaissance plane spotted the danger and warned the ship just in time. The crew responded quickly and changed the ship's direction, barely avoiding a hit. Spruance would later joke that if they had been struck, it would have been a deeply embarrassing moment rather than just a tragic one. Not long after, the cruisers New Orleans and Minneapolis aimed their fire at the already damaged Mikaze and completely destroyed it. This event stood out in naval history because it was the only time during the entire war that both Iowa and New Jersey, two of the most powerful battleships ever built, fired their main guns at enemy vessels during a direct sea battle. It was a rare opportunity for surface combat, something that had become less common as air power took center stage in modern naval warfare. Another ship, the Japanese minesweeper, shown in Maru 15, also tried to resist. Even though the situation was hopeless, her crew continued to fire their guns as the ship was being sunk by the American destroyer USS Burns. Their final moments were marked by determination, refusing to surrender until the ship completely went under the water. Out of all the Japanese ships that tried to escape, only one named Milwaukee managed to get away. The American battleships New Jersey and Iowa tried hard to chase it down, firing multiple long-distance shots in an attempt to stop it. One of those shells was launched from about 22 miles away, which is believed to be the longest range gunfire ever aimed at an enemy ship. Despite the incredible effort and firepower, Milwaukee slipped away and escaped destruction. In another part of the battle, the Japanese ship CH-24, which was a small submarine chaser, also attempted to flee. It was eventually spotted by USS Burns. Despite being smaller and weaker, CH-24 bravely fired back, using its single 3-inch gun. But the ship was no match for the American firepower. As it began to sink, the Japanese sailors jumped into the sea. USS Burns tried to help, attempting to pull the survivors from the water. However, many of the Japanese sailors refused to be rescued, possibly out of loyalty or fear of capture. The American crew managed to save 6 men, but the rest swam away, hoping that Japanese forces might return for them. To prevent any rescue by enemy forces, the captain of USS Burns dropped depth charges into the water, making sure no underwater escape or hidden submarine could come to their aid. As darkness fell over the waters of Truk Lagoon, the Japanese were still not ready to surrender. At about 7 p.m., a small group of Japanese Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, known as Kates, carried out a daring night attack. These planes had been fitted with radar equipment to allow for nighttime flying, a rare feature at the time. Though most of them were shot down by the heavy anti-aircraft fire from American ships, one bomber managed to slip through the defenses. Just after 10 p.m., this aircraft successfully hit the aircraft carrier USS Intrepid with a torpedo on the right rear side of the ship. The impact caused a powerful explosion that killed 11 men and injured 17 more. The ship's rudder was severely damaged, making it impossible to steer, and the Intrepid was forced to leave the battle and return for repairs that would take months. Despite this setback, Rear Admiral Mitcher remained determined to carry out the mission to the end. In the early hours of February 18th, he ordered the U.S. Navy's first-ever nighttime bombing raid launched from an aircraft carrier. 12 TBF Avenger bombers, specially modified to operate in the dark, took off from the carrier USS Enterprise. Each plane carried 4 500-pound bombs. Under the cover of night, they flew back toward the lagoon for a surprise attack. As they approached, a red flare was fired from Moan Island, alerting the Japanese anti-aircraft crews that another air raid was beginning. The sky lit up with gunfire as Japanese gunners used the faint light from the bombers' engines to aim. Several of the American aircraft were hit, and one was lost, but the bombing run was still successful. 8 Japanese ships were destroyed, and another 5 were damaged in the operation. At sunrise, the American forces resumed their assault. With no enemy aircraft left to defend the skies, American Hellcat fighters made another sweeping attack. They flew low over the airfields at Eaton, Moan, and Pam, shooting at grounded planes and any remaining ships they could find. There were no more dogfights, but ground-based guns still posed a threat. During this mission, one of the Hellcats flown by Lieutenant Junior Grade George Blair was hit by anti-aircraft fire. He crash-landed in the lagoon and climbed into his life raft. His squadron circled overhead to protect him while he waited for rescue. A Japanese destroyer began to move toward his location, but repeated low-level attacks from the Hellcats forced the ship to turn back. Eventually, a Kingfisher floatplane from the USS Baltimore arrived just in time. It landed on the water and pulled Blair safely aboard. The Kingfisher's crew later realized that they had returned to their ship with almost no fuel left. Barely a pint remained in the tank. The final wave of bombing was directed at the oil storage tanks on Dublin Island. Admiral Mitcher had purposely waited until the end to strike this target, knowing that the thick black smoke would block visibility and possibly interfere with earlier missions. Now, with the main goals of the operation complete, the last group of SPD Dauntless and TBF Avenger bombers dropped their payload on the tanks. Huge columns of smoke rose into the sky, marking the final act of the operation. By the end of February 18th, the American forces had achieved a decisive victory. In just 2 days of intense fighting, they had destroyed 10 Japanese warships, 31 cargo and transport ships, and nearly 270 out of the 365 aircraft based on the atoll. They had also wiped out 17,000 tons of fuel that had been stored there. In comparison, the United States lost only 25 aircraft, and the most serious damage suffered was the torpedo hit on the USS Intrepid. This overwhelming and well-coordinated attack was seen as the American version of Pearl Harbor, a surprise blow that completely shattered the idea that Truk was an unbeatable fortress in the Pacific. With the Japanese base effectively wiped out, American forces were able to take control of nearby islands without facing strong resistance. This success set the stage for the next major campaign, the invasion of the Mariana Islands, which would bring the United States even closer to victory in the Pacific War, although Japan made some small attempts to rebuild and use the base again in the months that followed. Those efforts were stopped by another U.S. carrier strike led by Spruance on April 29. Later, in June 1945, British forces also launched attacks on the area. Today, Truk Lagoon remains one of the world's most famous underwater graveyards. Dozens of warships and planes still rest at the bottom of the lagoon, making it a haunting reminder of the past and a popular destination for scuba divers from around the world who come to explore its deep